We are going to talk a little bit about what it means to be a refugee and some of the specific physical and mental health challenges of refugees. And the reason why we include this in public health nursing is there is a global humanitarian crisis with displaced people. Over 65 million people have had to flee their original homeland due to violence or persecution. So, what it means to be a refugee is it is a person who has crossed an international border and has a well founded fear of being persecuted. So, there is a process to go through to be designated a refugee, and it's very lengthy, complicated. But once displaced people have that designation, they are they can get some assistance and release through the international humanitarian law. An asylum seeker is basically somebody who's crossed an international border asking for protection, and their case is being reviewed whether or not they have refugee status. Internally displaced people are people who are displaced within their own country, and then a migrant is an individual who voluntarily left their homeland for a better life or for work, but typically that's voluntary. So it's important to know that in the pre flight phase of a migrant's journey, that's where they're in the country that has the war or the persecution. And if you've read any of the stories, it's usually horrific crimes are being committed. A lot of times, relatives have been taken and they don't know where they're at, or relatives and friends have been killed or raped. The situation is almost unbearable, and that's why so many people leave. During the flight phase, that's when people are on the move. Obviously, they're very vulnerable. The reception is the stage within the home country, or the country that they've left to. Settlement is within the country that they've fled to, and then resettlement has multiple options, but usually they can't return home, so it's settlement within the country they've fled to, or another country willing to accept the refugee. So let's go over just some of the stages in a little bit more detail. I am going to have you watch a video at the end of this PowerPoint, just a first person narrative of a Syrian refugee. So, usually in the pre flight phase, the person may lose touch with family members. They may have experienced violence. They definitely have at least seen violence, and there's a lot of breakdown in the structure of society. So everything we think about that we rely on in terms of, government offices, anything like that has been destabilized. So there's a lot of sort of violence, and each area is unique, but there's always violence and human rights violations. So during the flight phase, this can be fraught with danger. I know you've heard of, migrants being, boats capsizing. Usually there's not a lot of basic needs met with food, water, things like that. So when refugees or migrants, if they haven't been determined to be refugees, arrive at the country they're fleeing to, they're very relieved. But there's a whole host of other issues that come in to the situation at that point. So there's been a lot of stigmatization of refugees. Some of the host countries are frightened of the refugees. There's been stereotypes that refugees are violent, a lot of ethnocentrism, racism, discrimination. And so even when the reception is positive, there's the question of resources, and can the host population absorb the needs of the refugees? So during settlement, a lot of times that is within refugee camps, and sometimes people can be in refugee camps for over a decade. if the conflict or whatever they're fleeing just keeps going on. So it's important to note, and the video will somewhat show that when you're in a refugee camp, you're sort of in limbo. So you can't really get an education. A lot of times you can't, um, vote, get a driver's license. You don't really have citizenship status in the host country, and you don't have anything left of the country you came from. So this can last for over a decade, which obviously has a lot of mental health issues for those in the refugee camps. Resettlement, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but basically it's some type of integration into the community. And this is one of the big health determinants, is getting out of the refugee camp so you can begin a new life. So there's three solutions. Repatriation is where the individuals can go back to their home country. That's obviously the ideal solution and what we all would want, to go back to what we're familiar to. But a lot of times that's not possible because of the ongoing violence. If it's due to war, sometimes, the infrastructure has been destroyed by bombing. There's all kinds of reasons why that ideal solution is usually not able to be met. So reintegration is within the country that the person has fled to. That's the next best option, but not always possible. So resettlement is into a third country. And so most countries are willing to take a certain amount of refugees. The United States has closed its borders more so than in the past to refugees, but you'll see in the video that I'm asking you to watch that man was accepted in Canada. So life in a refugee camp, very overcrowded, a lot of communicable diseases. With the COVID virus, they're very concerned about refugees in the same manner as long-term care and incarcerated individuals. It's a lot of people in closed conditions. You also have in the refugee camp that sanitation issues. There's a lot of times no infrastructure for water or sewage, so communicable diseases pose a great health risk. There's a lack of privacy, obviously, in refugee camps, stress and fatigue, a lot of tensions run high, and then a general lack of health care, even basic health care. So violence is a problem. Sometimes if refugees have fled a war, they may be associated with different factions that were fighting, so that can lead to violence. Sometimes refugees will be from different cultures within the same camp, and so that can cause tension. The host population, depending on their initial reception and their viewpoints on the refugees, may be a source of violence. And then just within the refugee camp, a lot of times there's not obviously established policing and policemen, so there's less established order. And then sometimes if the camps are too large or poorly managed, and sometimes people have to leave the area to go get resources, and that can be a source of violence. And then just the high levels of stress from both what they've experienced and then the overcrowding in the camps. So as you can imagine, there's more gender-based violence in refugee camps, especially when there is a lack of income. So sometimes there's an exchange of sex for basic needs. Like I said, sometimes women have to travel outside the camps to more isolated areas for water or for basic needs. And then poorly planned camps. So what can we do about the violence? Empowering women as much as possible within culturally accepted methods, involving the community and addressing the violence. So sometimes the communities can come together and establish some basic policing type policies, and then planning and managing. So you can see even things like using lights where women and children have to travel, safe areas, safe times, and redoing how people are collecting resources in general, and making reporting simple for domestic violence and rape. And so there's a lot of aid agencies within these camps trying to help with these issues, set up some basic infrastructure, and get some basic health care in there. So Europe has been taking in the most refugees, both just from refugees arriving and then policies accepting refugees. And these are just some things that they're doing. So they're trying to get more electronic medical records, even if they're basic, so that people can be kept track of better and follow up better, making sure that any materials are in the language of the refugees, and then advocacy, um, like I said, just for infrastructure in the camp, giving people things to do. I know I've read stories of like teenagers who were, planning to go to college. There was one boy who's a straight A student. He wanted to be a doctor, and he ended up in the camp when he was like 16 or 17, and he has no citizenship status. So he hasn't been accepted anywhere. So he's in limbo, and he was asking for help with some kind of training, because basically for the foreseeable future he had no means of getting any kind of education. So trying to get programs in the camps and working on these issues of non-citizenship status, um, and then just monitoring for access to healthcare and information. So also, I'm not sure what's wrong with that slide, but as we talked about with the prison system, just making sure that health workers who are in the refugee camps have a lot of self-care. I'm sure you've read, some of these cases are just absolutely horrific, what's happened to people. So there's sort of a secondary trauma in trying to care for refugees. But it's an ongoing issue. Usually it's a fairly acute problem where, there's violence and massive people on the move. We see that with the border with the US and Mexico, refugees from Central America. And so it's difficult to manage these issues, but it's really important to address the physical and mental health. And again, trying to get to the issues that cause the refugee movement in the first place. So nurses can be advocates for policies that try and address the issues in the camps, or the issues that cause people to move into these camps through national policy. So what I'd like you to do now is just watch the short video on the Syrian refugee, and that is all.